I took a deep breath as sunlight poured through my bedroom window, warming my face. Willow Creek, the small Pennsylvania town where I lived, prided itself on tradition. People cared about appearances more than anything, and I had spent my entire life towing the line, afraid of what might happen if I strayed too far. "Eleanor, you're going to be late for the church meeting." My mother's voice rang from downstairs, sharp and commanding. "Coming!" I called back, quickly running a brush through my hair. Judith Lawson wasn't just my mother, she was a force to be reckoned with. As president of the Street Marks Women's Association, she had built an unshakable reputation. Perfect blonde hair, an impeccable wardrobe, and an ever-present air of control. To her, appearances weren't just important, they were everything. When I walked downstairs, my father, Richard, sat at the breakfast table, newspaper in hand, coffee in the other. He barely looked up as I greeted him. He had worked at the local bank for 40 years, eventually retiring as branch manager. Stern and composed, he had always demanded excellence. "Did you hear? Claire's husband just got promoted to senior partner," my mother announced with a satisfied smile. Claire, my older sister, had done everything right, married young, settled in a beautiful home, and built the perfect life my parents had always envisioned for their daughters. "That's great," I said, forcing a smile. I should have been used to these conversations by now, but they still stung. "You should really think about settling down, Eleanor. Sarah's daughter is already expecting her second child," my mother added, barely hiding her disapproval. I nodded out of habit, but inside, I wanted to scream. I wasn't Claire, and I never would be. By Monday, I was back at work at the Willow Creek Art Museum. If there was one place where I felt at peace, it was here. As an art restoration specialist, I spent my days bringing old paintings back to life, preserving beauty that had been forgotten. "Eleanor, how's the progress on the exhibition pieces?" My boss, Jessica, popped into my workspace. "Almost done," I replied, carefully working on an 18th century portrait. "This miniature is proving tricky, but it'll be ready in time." "Good," she nodded. "The Lost Era exhibition is our biggest event of the year. I trust you'll do an amazing job." As I returned to my work, one suddenly felt someone standing nearby. "Excuse me, is this the art restoration room?" The deep, steady voice made me pause. Turning, I saw a man at the doorway. He was dressed simply, jeans and a navy sweater, but he carried himself with quiet confidence. His brown hair was slightly tousled, and his glasses gave him a thoughtful, intellectual air. "Yes, but tours are only on designated days," I said, caught off guard by the unexpected visitor. "My apologies. I actually got special permission," he explained, offering a polite smile. "I'm Michael Carter. I have a deep interest in antique art, and asked Jessica if I could observe the restoration process." There was something about him, an earnestness in his eyes that made me hesitate. "All right," I relented. "I'm working on an 18th century miniature portrait." Michael stepped closer, studying my work. "Rococo style, isn't it? Known for its delicate brushwork." I blinked. "You know art history?" "Just as a hobby," he admitted with a modest smile. "I've always been fascinated by portraiture from the 17th to 19th centuries." As we talked, I found myself drawn to the conversation. He wasn't just knowledgeable, he listened in a way that made me feel seen. "Would you like to come to the exhibition opening?" I asked impulsively. "I'd love to hear your thoughts." Michael's smile widened. "I'd be honored." That night, he arrived as promised. We walked through the gallery, discussing each piece in a way that felt effortless. Afterward, we went to a small cafe nearby, talking for hours. He told me he was from Boston and worked in historical research. With him, I felt a sense of ease I rarely found elsewhere. "Your work is incredible," he said, watching me closely. "You bring lost things back to life. It's beautiful." I looked away, flustered by the warmth in his voice. "You really listen to me. That's rare." "What about your family?" he asked gently. I hesitated. "They don't really understand my work. My mother thinks it's time for me to get married." Michael reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "You have a remarkable talent, Eleanor. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. But then, just as suddenly as he had entered my life, he was gone. One evening, my phone rang. "Eleanor, I have to leave town for a while," Michael said, his voice heavy. "It's a family matter." "I'm sorry it's so sudden." "For how long?" I asked, unease creeping into my chest. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll come back as soon as I can." I promise. And then silence. His phone was disconnected. When I visited the address he had given me, a stranger answered the door. Michael Carter had vanished without a trace. Weeks passed, and confusion turned to heartbreak. But then, my world shifted again. A pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. I sat on the bathroom floor, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. Michael was gone, and I was pregnant. I stared at the pregnancy test, my hands trembling as reality settled over me like a heavy fog. 2 pink lines. There was no mistaking them. Michael was gone, and I was pregnant. A whirlwind of emotions crashed through me. Fear, disbelief, panic. I pressed my back against the bathroom wall, struggling to catch my breath. This wasn't how my life was supposed to go. Not here. Not in Willow Creek, where people whispered behind your back at the slightest hint of scandal. I had spent my entire life walking on eggshells, carefully crafting an image that wouldn't disappoint my parents. Now, in one cruel twist of fate, that image was shattered. For hours, I sat in my apartment, staring at the test. I knew I had to tell my family. The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't avoid it forever. They would find out eventually. And knowing my mother, the sooner I controlled the narrative, the better. The next evening, I drove to my parents' house, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender and old books filled the air. My father sat in his usual spot by the fireplace, reading the paper, while my mother prepared tea in the kitchen. It was a picture of normalcy, one that was about to be obliterated. I took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you both." My mother glanced at me, raising a perfectly arched brow. "What is it?" I hesitated, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "I'm pregnant." Silence. The teacup in my mother's hand clattered onto the saucer. My father lowered his newspaper, his sharp gaze locking onto mine. "Excuse me?" My mother's voice was eerily calm, but I knew better. "You heard me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm having a baby." "With whom?" My father's tone was clipped, measured. "His name is Michael Carter," I said, my throat tightening. "But I've lost contact with him." My mother inhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest as if she might faint. "So, you've been abandoned?" "No," I said quickly. "I don't believe that. Something must have happened to him." My father let out a bitter laugh. "Something happened?" That's what men say when they want to disappear. The weight of their judgment pressed down on me. I knew how they saw me now, not as their daughter, but as a mistake, a disappointment. "You can't raise a child alone," my mother said, shaking her head. "You have 2 options, abortion or adoption." A chill ran through me. "That's not happening." "You're ruining your life, Eleanor," my father said, his voice low and cold, "and disgracing this family in the process." I squared my shoulders, my hands shaking at my sides. "Then I guess I'll do it on my own." My father's eyes darkened. "If you walk out of this house with that decision, don't come back." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had always known my parents valued reputation above all else, but deep down, I had prayed that their love for me would outweigh their obsession with appearances. I was wrong. With my heart pounding, I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't cry. Not until I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel, gasping for air between sobs. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. 8 months later, I sat in my small apartment, cradling my newborn son, Nathan. He was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. His tiny fingers curled around mine, his breath soft and steady. Even though exhaustion clung to me like a second skin, I couldn't stop staring at him, memorizing every delicate feature. The past months had been a blur of survival. Jessica, my boss, had been my saving grace. She arranged for me to work from home, allowing me to restore paintings in my makeshift studio while caring for Nathan. The museum staff had become my family, stepping in where my real one had failed me. "How's my favorite little guy?" Jessica cooed as she stepped into my apartment one afternoon. She ran a gentle finger over Nathan's chubby cheek, then turned to me. "And how's his incredible mother?" "Tired," I admitted, rubbing my eyes. "But we're managing." Jessica smiled. "You're doing more than managing, Eleanor. You're thriving." I wanted to believe her. "Actually," she continued, pulling a folder from her bag, "I have something that might help even more. Foster International reached out to us. They need an expert restorer for a 17th century Dutch masterpiece. And I recommended you." My breath caught. "Are you serious?" Jessica nodded. "The compensation is generous. and it's a huge opportunity. Their representative is coming tomorrow for a meeting. I want you to handle it." Excitement flickered through me, but so did nerves. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," she said simply. "You deserve this." That night, after putting Nathan to sleep, I rummaged through my closet for something appropriate to wear. It had been so long since I had dressed formally. I found a simple black dress, one of the few nice things I had brought with me when I left home. As I ironed it, my mind buzzed with thoughts of the meeting. I was stepping into a new chapter, one where I wasn't just a struggling single mother, I was a professional, a woman who had built something for herself. The next morning, I arrived at the museum early, my heart pounding. Jessica greeted me with an encouraging smile as we walked to the conference room. "You've got this," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. At the far end of the long table, a man stood by the window, his back to me. There was something oddly familiar about the way he held himself. Then he turned around. The air left my lungs. Michael. He looked different, sharper, more polished. Gone were the casual sweaters and easygoing demeanor. Now he wore a tailored suit, his confidence radiating through the room. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice quieter than I remembered. Jessica cleared her throat, oblivious to the tension. "Eleanor, this is Michael Foster, the representative from Foster International." My stomach dropped. Foster International? I stared at him, my mind racing. He wasn't just some historian with a passion for antique art. He was Michael Foster, heir to one of the biggest art restoration firms in the world, and the father of my child. I couldn't breathe. Michael Foster, not Carter. Foster. The name echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. He wasn't just an art enthusiast from Boston. He was the heir to Foster International, a company worth billions. He had disappeared from my life, leaving me to fend for myself. And now, here he was, standing in front of me in a tailored suit, holding all the power in the room. I forced myself to speak. "You're Foster International's representative?" Michael's jaw tensed. "Yes." Jessica, still unaware of the storm raging between us, gestured toward the table. "Why don't you both go over the contract details? I'll step out for a moment." Before I could protest, she was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the man who had upended my life. Michael exhaled, his gaze searching mine. "Eleanor, I lifted a hand. "Don't." My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I had spent months wondering where he was, if he was okay, if I had meant anything to him. And now, after all that, I found out he had been living a completely different life, one he had never bothered to tell me about. Michael took a hesitant step closer. I never meant to disappear. "Really?" I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you did." He ran a hand through his hair, his composed mask slipping for the first time. I had to leave. My father was sick. I didn't have time to explain. There was time. I cut in. "You could have called. You could have written. Hell, you could have sent a message through someone at the museum. But you didn't." Michael flinched. "I lost my phone, and when I got back to Willow Creek, you were gone. No one at the museum knew where you were." I shook my head, anger flaring in my chest. "So, that's it? That's your excuse? You didn't even try?" His silence was damning. I folded my arms, forcing myself to stay calm. "You weren't some struggling researcher, were you? You were always the heir to Foster International." "Yes," he admitted, "but I didn't want that to define me. I wanted to meet someone who didn't care about my name or my wealth." I scoffed. "And instead, you made sure I didn't know the truth at all." Michael's eyes darkened. "Would it have mattered?" I blinked. "Excuse me? Would you have treated me the same way if you knew?" His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. "Would you have still trusted me?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that I would have seen past his name and money, but I hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Michael exhaled. "I didn't tell you because I wanted something real. And for a while I thought I had it. For a while I repeated bitterly. A sharp cry pierced the air. Nathan. I turned just as Jessica's assistant, Linda, poked her head in. "Sorry, Eleanor, I was watching Nathan, but he's looking for you." I reached for my son, his tiny hands grasping at me, his big brown eyes still filled with tears. He buried his face in my shoulder, his soft sobs muffled against my shirt. Michael went completely still, his gaze locked onto Nathan, his expression shifting from shock to something unreadable. I braced myself. "You have a child," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I met his eyes. "We have a child." Michael's entire body stiffened. He looked from me to Nathan, his face paling. "How?" His voice broke off. "You never told me." I let out a hollow laugh. "I tried, but you vanished. I searched for you, Michael. The first went to your apartment, but you were gone. No forwarding address, no explanation. What was I supposed to do?" He took an unsteady step forward. I didn't know." "Well, now you do," I said flatly. Michael's eyes flickered back to Nathan, who had calmed down but was still clutching onto me. He stared at him like he was seeing something he never thought possible. "How old is he?" I hesitated, but there was no point in hiding it. 8 months. Michael swallowed hard. "And you did this? Alone?" I bit my lip, my anger momentarily giving way to exhaustion. "Yes." A long silence stretched between us. Then Michael spoke, his voice hoarse. "I want to know him." My heart clenched. I had dreamed of this moment of him coming back, of him wanting to be a father, but dreams weren't reality. I don't know if I can trust you," I admitted. Michael's eyes flashed with determination. "Then let me prove it." Over the next few weeks, Michael didn't just say he wanted to be involved, he showed it. He visited us almost every day, slowly integrating himself into Nathan's life. At first, my son was wary of him, but Michael was patient. He learned how to feed him, how to soothe him when he cried, how to make him laugh. One night, as I watched them from across the room, I saw something I hadn't expected. Michael wasn't just trying to be present. He was falling in love with his son, and that terrified me, because if I let myself believe in him again, and he disappeared, I didn't think I'd survive it. One evening, as I put Nathan to bed, Michael lingered in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I nodded, stepping out of the nursery. "I know I messed up," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "And I know I don't deserve your trust overnight, but I want to be here. Not just for Nathan, but for you too." One swallowed hard. "Michael, the first still love you," he said simply. I never stopped. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had spent months convincing myself I'd moved on, that I didn't need him, that I was fine on my own. But hearing him say those words, it unraveled everything. I took a step back, shaking my head. "I don't know if I can do this again." Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. I felt my breath catch. He opened it, revealing a simple but stunning emerald ring. "I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to say yes now, but I need you to know I'm serious about this. About us. I'm not walking away again." Tears burned in my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I had no idea what to do. Michael had left before, but he had also come back. And now he was asking me to take a leap of faith. Could I do it? I looked down at the ring, my heart pounding, and for the first time since he had returned, I truly didn't know what my answer would be. I stared at the emerald ring in Michael's hand, my pulse hammering in my ears. He was waiting. I could see it in the way his fingers tightened around the box, in the barely concealed tension in his jaw. He was prepared for rejection, but there was hope in his eyes, hope I wasn't sure I could give him. I swallowed hard. "Michael, the first don't think I can do this. Not yet." His expression didn't change. If he was disappointed, he hid it well. Slowly, he closed the box and slipped it back into his pocket. "I understand," he said quietly. "I won't rush you." The weight in my chest didn't lift. I had expected him to be upset or try to convince me, but instead, he accepted my hesitation without argument. That scared me more than anything because it meant he was serious, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. Michael exhaled, glancing toward Nathan's room. I meant what I said, though. I'm not going anywhere. Whether or not we end up together, I'll always be in his life. I nodded, still gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing holding me upright. Okay, it was all I could say. And for now, it would have to be enough. Days turned into weeks, and Michael kept his promise. He didn't push. He didn't bring up the ring again. Instead, he focused on Nathan, showing up every morning before work, returning in the evenings to spend time with him. At first, it was awkward. I was so used to doing everything alone that accepting help felt unnatural. But Michael was patient, and slowly, we found a rhythm. One night, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I overheard him in the living room, reading to Nathan. His voice was low and steady, warm in a way that made my chest tighten. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Someone to share the weight. Someone who cared. So why was I still afraid? One afternoon, Jessica called me into her office. "I have news," she said, her tone careful. I frowned, sitting across from her. "Good or bad? That depends on you." She pushed a sleek envelope across the desk. I hesitated before picking it up. The second I saw the letterhead, my stomach dropped. It was an invitation to a private event at Michael's family estate. Jessica watched me closely. "Michael told me he was planning to introduce you and Nathan to his family. He wanted to give you time, but since the event is next week, he thought you should have a choice." I stared at the invitation. My name was printed in elegant script, as if I belonged there, as if I were already part of their world. But I wasn't, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be. Jessica leaned forward. "Eleanor, I know this is a lot, but think about it. You've done everything alone for so long. Maybe it's okay to let someone in." I let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can face them. Michael's family was powerful, wealthy, and from everything I had read about them, ruthless. What would they think of me? A single mother from a small town, raising their heir's child alone? Jessica smiled gently. "Then don't do it for them. Do it for yourself. And for Nathan," I swallowed. "I'll think about it." But deep down, I already knew my answer. The night of the event, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the fabric of my dress. It was a deep blue, simple but elegant. A last-minute gift from Michael. Nathan fussed in his crib, shifting in his tiny tuxedo. He wasn't thrilled about being dressed up, but his wide brown eyes were filled with curiosity. Michael arrived right on time, dressed in a sleek black suit. He paused in the doorway when he saw me, his gaze softening. "You look beautiful," he murmured. I cleared my throat. "Are you sure about this?" Michael stepped closer, his hand ghosting over mine before he caught himself and pulled back. "Yes." I glanced at Nathan. "And them?" "They'll love him," he said without hesitation. "They don't have a choice." I exhaled slowly. "All right, let's go." The Foster estate was everything I had expected: grand, sprawling, dripping with wealth. As we stepped inside, chandeliers glowed overhead, casting golden light across the polished marble floors. People whispered as we walked past. I wasn't imagining it. They knew who I was, or at least who I wasn't. Michael held Nathan with ease, the baby's small hands clutching at his tie. He didn't look nervous, but I knew better. Then a voice cut through the crowd. "So, you're the woman who stole my son away." A tall, regal-looking woman stood before us, her sharp green eyes raking over me with quiet calculation. Michael stiffened. "Mother." I forced myself to stand tall, even as my pulse spiked. Miss S. Foster smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Michael tells me you're an art restorer. How charming." I bristled at the condescension in her tone, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, I've been working in the field for years." "I see." She tilted her head. "And this is?" Michael's grip on Nathan tightened. "His name is Nathan, your grandson." A flicker of something crossed her face: surprise, uncertainty, but it vanished just as quickly. "I see," she said again. Then, to my shock, she reached out, brushing a gentle hand over Nathan's cheek. "He has your eyes." Michael exhaled, tension easing slightly. "I was hoping we could talk." Mrs. Foster's gaze flickered back to me. "I'm sure we will. But first, let's get through the evening, shall we?" With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Michael touched my arm. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile. "That could have been worse," he chuckled. "Trust me." That was her being nice. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Some of Michael's relatives were polite, others dismissive. A few outright ignored me. But it didn't matter, because through it all, Michael stayed by my side. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe he meant it when he said he wasn't going anywhere. As we left the estate, Nathan asleep in my arms, Michael reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. Maybe this was still terrifying. Maybe I still had doubts. But for the first time in a long time, I was willing to try. The drive back from the Foster estate was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Michael's hand remained in mine, a silent reassurance I wasn't sure I was ready for. Nathan was sound asleep in his car seat, his tiny hands curled into fists, unaware of the monumental night we had just experienced. Michael's mother had been cold, but not outright cruel. The whispers, the stares, the weight of judgment, I had expected all of it. What I hadn't expected was how fiercely Michael had stood by me, like he had nothing to prove to anyone except me and our son. As we pulled up to my apartment, I hesitated. Michael noticed. "What's wrong?" I exhaled, undoing my seatbelt. It feels like something's coming. Like things are shifting, and I don't know what it means yet." Michael studied me, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he nodded. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." I wanted to believe him, but part of me knew that nothing this big changed without consequences. Over the next few days, I expected Michael's mother to summon him, to lay out all the reasons why I wasn't good enough. But the call never came. Instead, something worse did. An invitation. A formal letter arrived at my door, embossed with the foster family crest. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. Michael found me staring at it later that evening, still unopened. "You're not going to read it?" he asked. "I don't know if I want to," I admitted. "Your mother didn't exactly scream welcome to the family." He smirked. "No, she didn't. But she didn't throw you out either, which means she's thinking. That's what I'm afraid of." Michael took the envelope from my hands and opened it. He scanned the letter, his expression unreadable, then handed it back. "It's an invitation to lunch. Just you and her." I felt my stomach tighten. "Alone?" He nodded. "She wants to talk." I swallowed hard. This could either be an olive branch or a warning. Should I go? Michael met my eyes. "That's up to you. But I don't think she would have invited you if she didn't think you were worth the effort." I wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Margaret Foster at an exclusive country club, trying to keep my hands from trembling. She was poised, elegant, every inch the woman I had expected her to be. A lifetime of power and control radiated off of her in waves, and yet, her expression was unreadable. The waiter poured tea, and she waited until he was gone before speaking. "You handled yourself well at the estate," she said, finally looking at me. I took a slow breath. I wasn't aware it was a test. A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Everything is, my dear." I set my cup down carefully. "Why did you ask me here?" Margaret studied me, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Michael is my son. He is also the future of our family. Everything we've built, everything his father worked for, will be his one day." I forced myself to stay still. "And you think I threaten that?" "I think you complicate it," she corrected. "And I don't like complications." The words should have made me defensive, but instead, I tilted my head. "If that were true, you wouldn't be here. You would have told Michael to walk away." Her eyes sharpened, like she was reassessing me. "You're perceptive." "I had to be." Margaret exhaled. "I wanted to see you for myself, to understand the woman who raised my grandson alone, without asking for a thing." "I didn't ask," I said, meeting her gaze. "But that doesn't mean we didn't struggle." She nodded slowly. "And yet, you endured. That tells me more about you than anything Michael could have said." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a calculated observation. Margaret set her napkin down. "I won't pretend to understand your world, just as I imagine you don't fully understand mine. But if you intend to stay in Michael's life, and by extension, ours, then you need to be prepared for what that means." I held my breath. "Which is," she leaned forward slightly, "your life will never be your own again. You will be watched, scrutinized. You and Nathan will be a reflection of this family, whether you like it or not. If you want to be with Michael, you need to decide if you're strong enough to withstand that." I clenched my hands beneath the table. "Are you asking me to walk away?" Margaret tilted her head. "No, I'm asking if you're ready to fight for him." I swallowed hard, realizing something. She wasn't my enemy. She was testing me, and I wasn't about to fail. I lifted my chin. "I already have." A long silence stretched between us before Margaret finally nodded, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Good." When I returned home, Michael was waiting. The second I walked through the door, he stood, searching my face for answers. "How did it go?" I let out a slow breath. "I think she respects me. Or at least, she respects the fact that I didn't back down." A smile tugged at his lips. "That sounds about right." I hesitated, then looked at him seriously. "Michael, she's right about one thing. Your world, it's bigger than mine, and I don't know if I'm ready for everything that comes with it." His smile faded. "Do you want out?" I looked at Nathan, sleeping peacefully in his crib. "My son. Our son." Then I turned back to Michael. "No, But I need time. Michael exhaled, then reached into his pocket. The ring. I stiffened, but instead of opening the box, he set it on the table between us. "It'll be here when you're ready," he said softly. I blinked back, sudden tears. "You're not mad?" Michael shook his head. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere." I took a shaky breath. Maybe I wasn't ready for marriage. Maybe I still had doubts about stepping into his world. But for the first time, I believed in something I hadn't before, that I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Time passed, but I still hadn't touched the ring. It sat on my nightstand, a silent reminder of the decision I wasn't ready to make. Some days I caught myself staring at it, wondering what it would feel like to finally say yes. Other days, I ignored it completely, pretending it wasn't there. Michael never mentioned it again. He gave me space, just like he promised. But that didn't mean he wasn't waiting, and I could feel it. Winter crept into Willow Creek, blanketing the town in snow. The holidays were approaching, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of belonging. Michael was in our lives now, fully and without hesitation. He knew Nathan's favorite lullabies, the exact way he liked to be rocked to sleep. He had learned how to cook breakfast with one hand while holding him in the other, and how to make him giggle just by pulling ridiculous faces. It was natural, effortless, like we had always been a family. And maybe, in some way we had. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. My mother. I hadn't spoken to her since she and my father had disowned me. For months, their silence had been absolute. And then, out of nowhere, this. My stomach twisted. Michael, who had been playing with Nathan on the floor, noticed my hesitation. "Everything okay?" I showed him the screen, his brows furrowed. "Are you going to answer?" I hesitated, then nodded. The second I picked up, my mother's voice came through, strained but composed. "Eleanor." I swallowed hard. "Mom." A pause. Then, "We'd like to see you." My grip on the phone tightened. "Why now?" There was a slight hesitation before she responded. "Because it's Christmas, and because we owe you that much." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had convinced myself that I didn't need them, that I was better off without their judgment, their impossible expectations, and maybe I was. But I also knew that if I didn't go, if I didn't at least try, I might regret it for the rest of my life. Michael watched me carefully. "Do you want me to come with you?" I exhaled. "No. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it alone." He nodded. "Okay." And just like that, I made my decision. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal. Everything looked the same, the neatly shoveled sidewalks, the twinkling holiday lights in the windows. But I felt different, stronger. When I knocked on the door, my father answered. His expression was unreadable, but he stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, just like it always had this time of year. My mother sat in the living room looking smaller than I remembered. When she saw me, something flickered in her eyes, relief maybe, or regret. She gestured to the couch. "Come sit." I did. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then my mother broke the silence. "We made a mistake." I blinked. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. "We were cruel to you. We abandoned you when you needed us most. And there is nothing we can say to undo that." My throat tightened. "We thought we were protecting our reputation," my father admitted. "But all we did was lose our daughter." I stared at them, at these people who had shaped my entire life, for better or worse. And then, quietly, I asked the question that had haunted me for months. "Would you still be saying this if Michael wasn't back?" Silence. Then my mother nodded. "Yes, because even if he had never returned, you still deserved better from us." Something in my chest cracked open. Maybe it wasn't a perfect apology. Maybe it never would be. But it was a start. I didn't move back home. I didn't pretend that everything could be magically fixed overnight. But I did let them meet Nathan. At first, he was hesitant, burying his face in my shoulder as my mother reached for him. But slowly, curiosity won. He peeked up at her with wide brown eyes, the same eyes Michael had. And just like that, something shifted. For the first time, I saw my mother not as the woman who had disowned me, but as a grandmother meeting her grandson. It didn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, it gave us a future. That night, I returned home to find Michael waiting, Nathan fast asleep in his arms. "How did it go?" he asked softly. I leaned against the doorway, exhausted but lighter than I had felt in months. "Better than I expected." Michael smiled. "I'm glad." I watched him for a long moment, my heart swelling with something terrifying and real. And then, before I could overthink it, I walked to my nightstand, picked up the ring, and held it out to him. Michael froze. "Eleanor, I'm ready," I said, voice steady. His eyes searched mine. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "You were right. It was never about the ring. It was about trust." "And I trust you," Michael exhaled, his entire body relaxing. Then, slowly, he took the ring from my hand and slid it onto my finger. It fit perfectly, just like us. A year later, I stood by the window of our home, watching as Michael played with Nathan in the snow. Laughter rang through the yard, light and carefree. I placed a hand on my stomach. Another baby on the way. Another chance to build the family I had once been so afraid of. Michael turned, catching my gaze. He grinned, brushing snow from his hair, and my heart did that familiar, traitorous flip. He was my beginning, my middle, and now, finally, my forever. Story 2. Cleveland. From Catherine Martin's office window, which looks out over the snow-covered streets, winter mornings always start out peacefully. She could see automobiles pulling into the hospital parking lot, one after the other. Having 10 years of expertise as a doctor, this morning ritual was nothing new to Catherine. But in the last 2 months, everything had seemed different. She grabbed her desk's picture frame, a picture of her and James joyful and hopeful on their wedding day. James, a prosperous corporate lawyer, had consistently been at her side, particularly after Catherine unintentionally touched her stomach that day. They had lost their long-awaited child 5 months prior, an extended hospital stay after experiencing unexpected stomach discomfort. Then, as she was thinking about the doctor's contrite attitude, she heard a knock. "The first patient is prepared," the nurse made a statement. After taking a deep breath, Catherine's professional grin returned. Her coping strategy was to immerse herself in her work. Later, it would be time to heal. They would cradle in each other's arms when James got home. The phone in the office rang. Catherine took the receiver in her hands. "It's Mom, Kathy." Catherine shut her eyes. "Mom." There was always a hint of anxiety in Elizabeth's voice. "Good morning. Are you in need of anything? I wanted to make sure regarding Thanksgiving. James's mother is invited, since I will be meeting her for the first time. In Cleveland's social circles, I want everything to be flawless." As the proprietor of an upscale chain of boutiques, Elizabeth Anderson was a well-respected individual. Above all, she treasured the idea of the ideal family and was always concerned with appearances and reputation. James's mom was invited. Surprised, Catherine inquired. "Indeed. Naturally. She belongs to our family, particularly in light of the latest incident. She appears to be taking care of you." The occasion? The miscarriage was something her mother frequently brought up, in this manner, like it was a bothersome mishap. The reputation of the family was damaged. "Thank you," Catherine honestly said. "Eleanor is a truly wonderful person." Eleanor Martin, James's mother, was among the kindest people she had encountered following her miscarriage. Eleanor participated in several initiatives to benefit women and children as a local philanthropist. More importantly, though, she had given Catherine her undivided love and support. In contrast to Elizabeth, Victoria, and Tom, they are bringing tiny Timothy. Elizabeth's voice was laced with pride. Having acquired Elizabeth's principles, Catherine's sister Victoria lived the ideal life. Victoria has a 3-year-old boy and was a stay-at-home mother, playing the part of the perfect housewife and father all the time. Catherine inquired about Thomas, her father. The powerful personality of her mother frequently cast a shadow over the retired university professor. By withdrawing into his studies in literature, he appeared to shield himself from family conflicts. "As normal, your father is cooped up in his study, not wanting anyone to bother you." When the talk concluded, Elizabeth didn't try to disguise her annoyance. Looking out the window, Catherine looked. Family get-togethers are common over Thanksgiving. By now, she ought to be 7 months pregnant. As she felt the baby move inside her, she ought to have been enjoying the occasion with her loved ones. She pulled out her cell phone and texted James. "Eleanor was invited to Thanksgiving by Mom. Is that acceptable?" The response arrived instantly. "Naturally. We work as a team. Together, let's overcome this." Catherine grinned. Through every storm, James was her pillar of support. Both Eleanor and he stood by her side. James and Catherine were sitting on the sofa in the living room that evening, sipping wine and thinking back on the day. I wonder why Mom invited Eleanor out of the blue, Catherine pondered. James gave a shrug. My mom was happy. She had long desired to meet your family. But it's Thanksgiving. Catherine was very selective about what she said. Family get-togethers can occasionally be difficult, particularly when Mom and Victoria don't understand me well, or circumstances. James gave her hand a squeeze. Everything will be well. My mom is also on our side. We'll help each other out no matter what. Leaning against him, Catherine took solace in his words. She still felt a great deal of anxiety. She had been subjected to subtly critical remarks and comparisons from her sister and mother for years. She received criticism for putting her medical profession first and delaying marriage. Now, following the miscarriage, what would people think of her? The telephone rang. Eleanor was the one. Tomorrow, how about we have lunch together? Near your hospital, I have a company. Catherine grinned. Eleanor seemed to always show up when required, and her timing was impeccable. Yes, I would really want to. Eleanor welcomed Catherine with a bright grin at a tiny cafe in town the following day. Eleanor was a refined yet grounded woman whose presence was always reassuring. Eleanor remarked, "Thank you for the invitation to Thanksgiving." On the phone, "Your mother was really nice." Catherine chuckled. Mom's social voice is that. She is trying to keep up her image as the ideal hostess. Eleanor put her hand to hers. "Are you all right? Thanksgiving, particularly this year, may be emotional at times." Catherine inhaled deeply. "I must admit that I am a little anxious. Victoria and Mom don't seem to care much about my miscarriage. To them, it appears to be the outcome of my dedication to my work." Eleanor answered firmly. "Nonsense. In addition to becoming a fantastic doctor, you will also make a fantastic mother in the future. Method and timing are irrelevant. Love is what counts." Catherine's eyes filled with tears at those words. These were the words that she needed: unwavering support and profound comprehension. Catherine and James arrived at the Andersons' opulent house on Thanksgiving Day. With flawless hair and cosmetics, Elizabeth welcomed them as she opened the door. "You're late, Kathy James," she said. In the living room, Victoria was already playing with Timothy. She wore a pricey cashmere sweater and her hair was done flawlessly. "Is Eleanor already present?" Catherine inquired. "Indeed." As Catherine and James walked into the living room, Elizabeth remarked, rather sarcastically, "She came on time." Eleanor sprang to her feet to greet them. Apparently, she and Timothy had been playing on the floor. Eleanor gave them an embrace. "At last you succeeded," Victoria grinned as she scooped up her kid. "A long time has passed. You look nice. Have you put on a few pounds?" "The first minor strike. Work has been busy," Catherine said, keeping her grin intact. "I've been too busy to work out." Thomas came out of his study and gave his daughter a tender hug. "I'm happy you arrived." His eyes were filled with sincere desires. Under the veneer of friendly banter and smiles, Catherine could feel her mother and sister's icy looks. These took the form of brief, caustic comments, deep eye contact, and subtly disparaging her line of work. "Dinner is ready, everyone." As the family made their way to the dining room, Elizabeth said with the quintessential hostess grin. Catherine inhaled deeply. The night was going to be long. "We're in this together," James muttered as he clasped her hand. In the Anderson family dining room, Eleanor also gave her a comforting smile. They laid out a sumptuous Thanksgiving supper. Delectable scents flooded the area as the table was lighted by a crystal chandelier. Everyone praised Elizabeth as she started to carve the bird. Eleanor said, "This year's turkey looks especially delicious." She held her wine glass up beautifully. "I appreciate your amazing hospitality." Elizabeth grinned contentedly. "Thank you. For our family, nothing is more significant than our Thanksgiving customs. Let's raise a glass." Thomas lifted his glass to health, family, and getting together once more the next year. A moment of joyful mood flowed as the sound of glasses clinking reverberated. Under the table, Catherine gripped her husband's hand. "Everything is going okay so far. Give me your plate, Catherine." Catherine held out her plate and Elizabeth gave a piece of turkey. Elizabeth stopped and examined her from head to toe. "Have you lately put on weight? You are no longer pregnant. You must use caution." Silence fell across the table for a minute. Catherine's style was tightened by James's touch. Eleanor's eyes became wide with shock. Winningly, Elizabeth Thomas said. Elizabeth gave a shrug. What? A mother has a responsibility to be concerned for her daughter. Catherine grinned and inhaled deeply. Thank you. But despite the tight environment, I'm content with my physique. Victoria stroked her son's hair and chuckled. Don't say stuff like that, Mom. However, moms must always consider their children. Those remarks aggravated the wound like salt. Catherine made an effort to eat quietly. Her hands shook a little. Timothy has already begun his kindergarten preparations. Victoria brought up her kid instead. He is quite smart, according to his professors. Grandpa Thomas must have been his ancestor. Thomas gave his grandson a kind grin. Catherine, what an amazing youngster he is, Elizabeth stated abruptly. Are you attempting to conceive another child with James? Catherine found it difficult to put the food in her mouth. It's a personal thing between us, Mom. It is, of course. But I'm concerned as a family. You are 35 years old already. Time is running out. Eleanor raised her voice softly. That's a little bit, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, however, silenced her with a sweep of her hand. You may be able to relate as the mother of an only boy. However, I hope my two girls are happy since I am their mother. Elizabeth picked up her glass of wine and stirred it carefully. In fact, your event has been on my mind. Catherine stopped. A mishap? Honestly, Elizabeth answered. Your miscarriage. You should have been aware of the hazards as a doctor. She was stressed, worked long hours, and looked for words. And your age, too. Catherine shook her voice. Please. Not right now. But Elizabeth smiled and went on. In a way, the family may have benefited from your miscarriage. Actually, Catherine, you've always been so preoccupied with your career. You weren't prepared to be a mother, in my opinion. We have avoided having a family member with a defect. Around the table, relatives chuckled uncomfortably. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with rage as Thomas put his hands over his face. Victoria grinned and gave her kid a hug. Only true moms belong here, I suppose. Catherine's hands were trembling, firmly grasping the silverware. In her mind, everything appeared to move slowly. Her life had been taken from her body. The innumerable evenings she had sobbed. Even the fact that she was a mother was now being suppressed. She got out of her chair slowly. Suddenly there was tension in the room. Kathy James called her name softly. Catherine remained still. She fixed her gaze on her mom. Elizabeth's face, old yet still lovely. The woman she had loved, feared, and adored. James put his hand on his wife's shoulder and got to his feet. He gazed at his mother-in-law, Elizabeth, with icy eyes. We're going until you retract what you just stated. Elizabeth had a startled expression. Well, James, I just said it like family. Don't we need to be honest? That's not being honest. It's brutality. Eleanor got to her feet too. Despite being low, her voice was full of determination. The coldness of Thanksgiving in this house surprised me. Victoria gave an eye roll. Please. Everyone is going overboard. Mom is just worried. At last, Catherine said something. Her voice wavered, but it was unmistakable. James and I had been hoping for a child for 2 years. I felt like I had failed as a woman, a doctor, and a prospective mother on the day I miscarried. I now see, however, that I did not fail. But you didn't support and love me. Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak. However, Catherine stopped her with a raised hand. There was more than simply opinion in what you said across the table tonight. They rejected my experience and disregarded my suffering. Even worse, they disparaged the life I lost. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she remained resolute. On each side of her were Eleanor and James. Mom was going out, as well as tomorrow. Please consider your remarks from tonight. Even though I love you, I am unable to forgive you at this time. With James and Eleanor at her heels, she carefully set her napkin on the table and walked out of the dining room. Elizabeth sat dumbfounded. James's appearance when he entered the Cleveland skyscraper the morning after Thanksgiving was obviously out of the ordinary. As he rode the elevator to the level of his law office, his face was marked with rage and resolve. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. Elizabeth Anderson's sardonic smirk, his wife's wounded countenance, and her mother's harsh remarks. I assumed this was a holiday, Jim. Michael, his co-worker, replied, looking astonished. James said succinctly, I have an urgent case. Would you kindly schedule a meeting space and give David from corporate and Karen from the tax department a call? Michael arched his eyebrow, but gave a questionless nod. Has anything noteworthy occurred? James gave a long, deep breath. Indeed, It has to do with how yesterday's Thanksgiving was handled by my wife's family. Will you return to the case of Anderson Boutiques? Michael's gaze expanded. Yes, James said coolly. I have avoided contact out of respect for my mother-in-law. It's time to implement the law equitably now, though. Assembled in front of the attorneys in the meeting room. Elizabeth Anderson's firm, Anderson Boutiques, has long-standing legal challenges, problems with employee working conditions, contracts with business partners, and abnormalities in tax processing, James informed calmly. He had previously delegated this matter to other colleagues out of regard for his mother-in-law. However, he said sternly, I will personally handle this case from today on. I'll carefully review every piece of evidence and, if required, pursue legal action. There will be no personal sentiments involved. We shall act solely in accordance with the law. Meanwhile, in another area of Cleveland, Eleanor was at a local women's support group's emergency board meeting. Wearing a dapper suit, Eleanor's normally placid visage was filled with steely intent as she entered the conference room. She thanked the board members gathered there for coming together today. Before our organization chooses its next chairwoman, I feel compelled to bring up a crucial point. The board members gave Eleanor a questioning glance. In Cleveland's charitable circles, she was regarded as one of the most esteemed individuals. Her statements were significant. Elizabeth is a contender to be the next chairman, as far as I know. She went on in a matter-of-fact manner. We must carefully examine if she genuinely shares our beliefs and objectives, nevertheless. Keeping her emotions in check, Eleanor gave a detailed account of what happened during Thanksgiving last night. The implications of Elizabeth's hurtful remarks to a woman who had suffered a miscarriage. The goal of our organization is to uplift and honor all women. Eleanor had a modest yet strong voice. A spokesperson of a group that promotes women's support shouldn't, in my opinion, be someone who disparages women who have suffered miscarriages. At the same time, Catherine was doing her routine examinations of patients at the hospital, but her heart was not content. After coming home last night, she had finally let go of the feelings she had suppressed for years. She sobbed in James's arms as she talked of her mother's verbal abuse and her sister's treachery. A nurse knocked lightly on her office door. Your mother's on the phone, Dr. Catherine. After inhaling deeply, Catherine picked up the receiver. Mom is here. Elizabeth's tone was more nervous than normal. I would want to discuss last night. Now I'm at work, Catherine said coolly. And it's difficult to forget what you said. It's overly sensitive of you. I was just... Catherine cut her off. To be honest, I'm not ready to speak with you just yet because I'm at work. Give me some time, please. For the first time, she looked out the window after hanging up. She felt compelled to break free from her sister's and mother's poison. Weeks went by, and things quickly got out of hand. Elizabeth's business unexpectedly had to deal with working environment inspections and tax audits. James was giving legal help to whistleblowers, bringing the company's wrongdoings to light one after another, despite his outward appearance of indifference. He told his wife that this was a business issue. She should be held accountable if she violated the law. Elizabeth's standing in social circles started to wane around the same period because of the significant discussion of Eleanor's situation within women's support groups. Elizabeth was forced to voluntarily abstain from the next election for chairman. She also faced pressure to leave other organizations where she was a board member, claiming personal reasons. The doorbell rang one evening while Catherine and James were having supper. Victoria stood and opened the door. Her makeup was smeared, and her eyes were crimson. "Hear me out," she begged. After a brief hesitancy, Catherine allowed her sister inside. Victoria sobbed as she described the circumstances in the living room. The family's standing in the neighborhood was quickly deteriorating, and her husband's business had strong connections to Elizabeth's boutique and was also impacted by the ongoing probe. "Every day, Mom cries," Victoria added. "Kathy, she thinks this is all your retaliation." "Stop this, please." Catherine gazed at her sister Victoria quietly. "This isn't retaliation. These are the results. Repercussions for what you said and what Mom did. We are family, though." Victoria let out a cry. "Family," Catherine muttered. "The youngster was humiliated by you and Mom on Thanksgiving night. I was defeated. And now you're requesting assistance. Does family imply that?" Victoria stopped talking. For the first time, before Christmas, her face took on a look of comprehension. At last, Elizabeth gave Catherine a call. Her voice was no longer confident or strong. "Please," she said, "let's talk about how to fix this. For Christmas, the first want the entire family to be together." Catherine gently answered, "I'm sorry, but I'll be spending this Christmas with my new family." "A new family?" Elizabeth shook her voice. Catherine described Eleanor and James, as well as the kids. "From the orphanage, Eleanor helps. We're going to eat supper together and give out gifts. I've been looking for a family like this. A place where people love and support one another." Catherine hung up and looked out the window at the wintry scene. Her heart was filled with both anguish and a feeling of freedom and hope for the future. She and James had started talking about adopting a child. They had learned about the need for caring homes for children from Eleanor. "Love, not blood ties, determine our family," Catherine said softly. During the snowmelt season, in Catherine's garden, Ohio spring arrived late. The emergence of little birds from the ground signaled the start of fresh life. She had a paper in her hand as she stood near the window of the living room. "The review has been accepted." She grinned at James as she turned around. "Officially, we are up for adoption." James gave his wife a hug. "Fantastic. Let's crack open the champagne." Victoria's name was displayed on the screen as Catherine's smartphone rang at that very time. Catherine let out a sigh. She hadn't spent much time with her birth family since Christmas. On the other end of the phone are brief chats and flimsy pleasantries. Her sister was in tears. "Please assist. Tom's business has suffered greatly, and Mom's business has declared bankruptcy." Her voice faltered. "We might lose our house." Looking out the window, Catherine looked. She had only just started to go on with her life. She was getting ready to welcome Lily and Rose, twin girls, into their household with James. Did she truly intend to rekindle old wounds? "At last," she remarked, "I'll speak with James. However, I am unable to promise anything." Catherine hung up and told James what had happened. After giving it some thought, he recommended speaking with Eleanor as well. At Catherine's place the following day, Eleanor drank coffee and listened in silence. Finally, she added, "I support you whatever you decide, but keep in mind that forgiveness is for you, not for the other person." An unknown vehicle pulled up in front of Catherine and James's residence over the weekend. Victoria and Elizabeth stopped going out with their self-assured looks. They both seemed worn out. Victoria's face displayed intense concern, and Elizabeth's expensive brand clothing wasn't worn as well as it had. Elizabeth smiled nervously and added, "Thank you for coming." Catherine greeted the two in silence. "Come in, please." Eleanor was sitting in the living room already. After some hesitation, Elizabeth took a seat. There was tension in the room. "Do you want a drink?" Catherine inquired. "Thank you, but no." Elizabeth's voice was small when she replied. She was obviously uneasy. "I came to speak openly, as you are our only remaining hope." James joined Catherine as she sat calmly. "What do you mean, please?" Victoria and Elizabeth alternated in describing the circumstances. The tax audit resulted in Anderson Boutiques incurring enormous debt and having to pay a hefty fine. Because of the business relationship, Victoria's husband, Tom, had also lost investments. Their life's foundation was now on the verge of collapsing. Finally, Elizabeth added, "We're family, so I want you to help." "Don't you and James have money? Are you able to provide us some?" There was silence in the room. Catherine fixed her gaze on her sister and mother. I remembered the lines from Thanksgiving evening, flawed, actual mother. Those who had said such things were now requesting assistance. "Why should I assist?" Catherine asked in a low voice. "You made fun of my suffering on the evening of Thanksgiving. The kid I lost was called by you. Flawed. Why should I assist these individuals?" Victoria broke down in tears. "I was mistaken. I spoke inappropriate things that evening, but consider Timothy. He is really young." Elizabeth's eyes were wet too. Catherine and I. She found it difficult to speak. "I was mistaken. I had no intention of hurting you. It wasn't your intention to harm me." Catherine's voice lifted a bit. "Do you honestly believe that?" Elizabeth closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. At last, she confessed that I was jealous. "I'm envious of your success as a doctor, your independence, and your refusal to follow my advice and live like me." The room became quiet once more. Her mother's revelation caught Catherine off guard. In actuality, her mother had been envious of her freedom, but she had always felt let down by her, and that she wasn't as good as her. "As you mentioned, only true family should be allowed here. Catherine responded calmly. However, blood ties are not what constitute true family. It's about relationships in which individuals value and encourage one another. She looked at James. He got up and brought the study's paperwork. What is this? Examining the papers, Elizabeth inquired. This is a proposal to assume the debt of Elizabeth's business. As a lawyer, James clarified, we'll buy the business and revamp it. The brand name will endure, and employee positions will be preserved. There are a few conditions, though. Victoria and Elizabeth gazed at the papers with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What conditions? Elizabeth's voice was raspy as she asked. Catherine bent over. Victoria and you will first volunteer at a support group for women who are experiencing infertility or miscarriages. For a year, at least 8 hours a week. Offer to help, Victoria questioned, looking perplexed. Indeed, Eleanor works at the organization, Catherine clarified. You will hear from women who have miscarried or are unable to conceive and discover ways to help them. Secondly, James went on, offer Catherine and other women who have experienced similar things an official apology. Elizabeth held the papers tightly. She was shaking her hands. She appeared to be torn between need and pride. Give me time, she responded at last. Till tomorrow, Catherine answered coolly. This is your final opportunity. It is up to you whether or not we can truly become a family. From now on, following the departure of Victoria and Elizabeth, Catherine turned to face James and Eleanor. Did I make the correct decision? With anxiety, she inquired. She grasped Eleanor's hand. Although people may adapt, there are situations when forced learning is required. You offered them an opportunity to change. The best present is that. Catherine looked at pictures of the twins up for adoption that evening. Considering what is ahead, a new kind of family, love, and the potential to mend a damaged past and form new relationships, bind them together, even if they are not biological relatives. Her phone rang the following morning. Elizabeth had left a message. I'm really sorry and agreed to the terms. Catherine inhaled deeply. This was a fresh start rather than the finish. Cleveland was once more in the Thanksgiving season. A year later, Catherine and James's house was filled with warm light, and the smell of pumpkin pie and turkey filled the air from the kitchen. Lily and Rose, twin sisters aged 7, were reading a picture book in the living room and giggling. They had only been a family for 6 months. Catherine responded, taking off her apron. Everyone will be here soon. Is everything prepared? As he finished preparing the turkey, James nodded. Excellent. Since Eleanor promised to arrive a little early, it should happen at any moment. The twin girls hurried over when the doorbell rang and called out to Grandma. Eleanor stood holding gifts in both hands and opened the door. My beautiful grandkids. She gave the girls a hug. Victoria and Elizabeth, as well as her son Timothy, followed. They had altered significantly from a year earlier. Elizabeth's face had softened, and her preoccupation with flawless looks had subsided. Additionally, Victoria exuded a softer vibe. Kathy. Elizabeth spoke a little uneasily. This is what I brought. She presented an apple pie that she had cooked herself. A wonderful dessert from a posh store would have been presented by the previous Elizabeth. Thank you. Catherine took it with a smile. Made at home? Elizabeth gave a rather ashamed nod. The women from the support group have been teaching me how to cook. I learn a lot from them. At the dining table, everyone was seated. The atmosphere was very different than it had been the year before. During the prayer before the dinner, there was a calm warmth and a spirit of reconciliation rather than tension and sarcasm. Elizabeth started to cry as she said, "This last year taught me the value of family, not family connections, but relationships based on mutual respect and support in trying times." Her gaze landed on Catherine's eyes. Eleanor, James, and Catherine, I appreciate you giving me this crucial lesson. She persisted in spending time with women who were experiencing infertility and miscarriages. I've discovered the power of language. Words have the power to both heal and cause great pain. My remarks from the previous year were unacceptable. She gave her twin girls a hug. This is the true meaning of our last Thanksgiving, Catherine added with a smile. The arrival of fresh love and understanding, and the cessation of bigotry and hostility. Catherine and her mother went into the garden after supper. The fall leaves shone exquisitely in the dusk. How is Anderson doing? Boutiques? Catherine inquired. Elizabeth grinned. It's taking a different course. The idea of clothing for all women has emerged, catering to a variety of body shapes and requirements. It's a significant move, but a minor shift. Additionally, what are you doing at the community support center? I was saved by that. Elizabeth provided an honest response by speaking with infertile and miscarried women. I learned via empathy and faced my own biases. I now attend counseling training twice a week. Catherine watched her family as the sun went down. Together with the twin sisters, Eleanor was reading a book. Victoria and James were also talking about how to prepare the kids' upcoming vacation. Father Thomas joins the discussion as well, his appearance serene and retiring. Her heart was content. This was the real definition of family acceptance and understanding, not perfection. Not judgment, but love and support. And most importantly, the guts to welcome change and progress. "Mom, thank you," replied Catherine softly, "for altering." Elizabeth grinned appreciatively as she grasped her daughter's hand.